There is a generation that nobody ever properly named. Not Gen X, not millennial, something in between, something that carried the values of one world and the tools of another, and never quite belonged to either. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, that generation is you. And here is what makes your experience unlike any other generation that has ever existed. You are the last people alive who remember what the world felt like before everything changed. And the first people who had to adapt to a world that became completely unrecognizable within your own lifetime. No generation before you had to make that crossing. No generation after you even remembers there was anything on the other side. Only you lived both. And that specific experience, growing up in one world and being reshaped by a completely different one, left a psychological mark that most of you have been carrying without a name for your entire adult life. This video is that name. Stay until the end, because this isn't nostalgia. This is the explanation you never got. And by the time it's over, a lot of things are finally going to make sense. If this is already resonate somewhere real, hit subscribe. We break down psychology and human behavior every week in a way that actually makes sense. Now let's get into it. You grew up in a world that no longer exists. Go back for a second. You rode your bike across town and nobody knew exactly where you were. No tracking, no check-ins. Just gone. And back when the streetlights came on, that was the signal, not a text, not a call. The streetlights. And you knew. You built forts. You climbed trees that were probably too tall. You invented games out of nothing because there was nothing else. And when it rained, you stayed inside and played until your eyes hurt. Friday nights meant Blockbuster. The ritual of walking the aisles, picking up the box, reading the back, debating. If the one you wanted was already gone, you adapted. No drama, you picked something else and got on with it. If you missed a TV show, you waited. Sometimes weeks, no catch-up, no streaming, no clip the next morning. You either watched it live or you asked someone at school what happened, and that 5-minute conversation in the corridor was more satisfying than anything an algorithm has ever put in front of you since. You wanted a song, you sat next to the radio with your finger on the record button, sometimes for an hour, and when it finally came on and you caught it, that feeling has never been replicated. And you did all of this without a single camera watching, no documentation, no permanent record. You did stupid things, and they stayed between you and the people who were there. You had the freedom to fail, to embarrass yourself, to be fully human without consequence. And that freedom, to exist without being watched, shaped your psychology in ways that are almost impossible to explain to someone who grew up without it. This is why presence comes naturally to you. This is why you can sit in silence without reaching for your phone. This is why the connections you made back then feel different from almost everything since. They were built in the real world, fully, without an audience, and that made them real in a way that is genuinely rare now. You were shaped by uncertainty before you were old enough to process it. A lot of people born in this window came home to an empty house after school, key around your neck, door unlocked. Snack made alone. Not because your parents didn't love you, because the world expected children to manage themselves in a way nobody would consider acceptable today. You weren't supervised. You weren't guided through everything. You weren't asked how you felt about your homework. You just figured it out, and you got good at figuring it out. And then you kept doing it, and it became so automatic that you stopped noticing it was something other people didn't do. Psychologists who study this generation find the same pattern consistently: extremely high self-sufficiency, a deep resistance to asking for help, a tendency to carry hard things alone before letting anyone in. Not because you're closed, because from the age of 9, handling it yourself was just what you did. Have you ever noticed that asking for help feels almost physically uncomfortable? That when something goes wrong, your first move is to solve it, not say it. That didn't come from nowhere. It was written into you before you were old enough to choose it, and it has been running quietly in the background of every decision you've made since. This is why you are the person people call when something breaks. This is why you are better under pressure than most people expect. This is why independence has never felt like a personality trait to you. It just feels like who you are. You came of age when the world kept proving it could change without warning. Your late teens and 20s landed inside some of the most destabilizing events of the modern era. The AIDS crisis, Columbine, 9/11, the dot-com collapse. You didn't just hear about these things, you were in the middle of becoming yourself when they happened. They shaped your understanding of how the world works at the exact window when that understanding was still being formed. Psychologists call this the critical period of identity formation, the years between roughly 15 and 25, when your fundamental beliefs about safety, trust, and the future get locked in. For people born between 1976 and 1985, that window kept delivering the same message. Things can fall apart without warning. That didn't make you pessimistic. It made you clear-eyed. It made you someone who prepares for things going wrong because you have actually watched things go wrong. You saw what happened to people who gave everything to institutions that didn't return the loyalty, and you made a quiet internal decision. Not me, but it also left something else underneath. A low-level background hum that never fully switches off. A difficulty relaxing completely into good periods because some part of you is always waiting for the shift. A resilience that is completely genuine because it wasn't taught, it was built. Does this sound familiar? That feeling of never quite being able to fully trust that things will stay good? That's not anxiety. That's a generation that learned the hard way that stability is something you build, not something you're handed. If this is landing, if you're sitting there thinking nobody has ever put this into words before, drop a comment right now that says, "This is exactly me." I read every single one. And what's coming next is the part that will finally explain something you've been carrying quietly your whole life. You never fully belonged to any generation. And it showed. This is the thing most people born in this window have never heard said clearly. You were too young for Gen X, too old for millennial. And so for your entire adult life you have existed in a gap, a space where neither generation's story quite fit you, and you were never quite sure why. Gen X content didn't fully resonate. You weren't cynical enough. Millennial content didn't fully resonate. You weren't digital enough. You watched both groups build entire identities around their generational experience, and you quietly thought, that's almost me. But not quite. And the music said everything about this. You had Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston were soundtracks of growing years. Joy, spectacle, pure feeling. Then you had Nirvana, Tupac, Oasis while growing up. Just the music of your youth. Raw, real, unpolished, music that didn't ask permission to hurt. Both of those things are inside you. That range, from full joy to deep grief, is part of how you feel everything. That experience of almost belonging, of standing adjacent to every group but never fully inside any of them, has a specific psychological effect. It creates a quiet, persistent sense of not quite fitting, of being slightly out of step, of wondering what is wrong with you for never fully connecting with the people your age. Nothing was wrong with you. You were a bridge. You carried the emotional depth of one world and the practical tools of another. That made you capable of understanding almost everyone, and left you feeling understood by almost no one. This is why you connect more easily with people older and younger than you than with your own peers. This is why you've always felt slightly ahead of some conversations and slightly behind others. This is why the word generation has never quite captured who you are, because you were never just one thing, what this generation built that nobody gave them credit for. Here is what I want you to hear. Everything this generation went through, the empty houses, the uncertainty, the two completely different worlds, the never quite fitting, produced something that most people will never fully understand unless they lived it. You are one of the most adaptable people alive. You can have a real conversation without a screen between you. And you can navigate any technology handed to you. You remember what it felt like to be bored and invent something from nothing. And you also know how to move in a fast-changing digital world without panicking. You built resilience before resilience became a concept on a poster. You developed self-sufficiency before it became a productivity trend. You learned to connect genuinely, face-to-face, fully present, before connection became something you could perform from a distance. You got lost and found your way home without GPS. You disagreed with people face-to-face and worked it out. You were bored and you made something. You failed and nobody filmed it. Research on psychological resilience consistently shows that people who navigated significant change during their formative years develop stronger coping mechanisms, higher tolerance for uncertainty, and more genuine empathy than those who grew up in more stable conditions. That is you. Not because life was harder for you, because the specific combination of freedom, uncertainty, and two completely different worlds created something in you that is genuinely rare. This is why you handle crisis better than people expect. This is why you can read a room in a way that takes others years to learn. This is why nothing you went through was wasted, even the parts that felt like too much. It was all building something. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you were not born at the wrong time. You were not between generations. You were not too much of one thing or too little of another. You were not the forgotten middle child of a cultural conversation that kept leaving you out. You were a generation of your own. The independence that sometimes feels like loneliness, that was training. The adaptability that sometimes feels like rootlessness, that was strength. The in-between that sometimes felt like not belonging, that was actually the clearest view in the room, because you could see both worlds when everyone else could only see one. Viktor Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Your generation didn't just change, you transformed. Quietly. Without being asked, without being recognized for it, without anyone making a big deal about it, until now. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you were never between generations. You were a generation of your own, and it's time you started seeing yourself that way. If this finally explained something you've felt your whole life, subscribe. Break down psychology and human behavior every week in a way that actually makes sense. The comment of the day goes to everyone born in this window who spent decades feeling like they almost belonged everywhere but never quite fully belonged anywhere. You weren't lost. You were just ahead of the language that could describe you. And now you finally have it.